It's my honor and privilege tonight to introduce Mr. David Straub, who is currently serving as the inaugural Daejung Ellis Fellow at the Daejung Institute, an independent and non-partisan Korean private policy think tank. David was a Korean diplomat serving with the State Department for 30 years, from 1976 to 2006. He also served at the American Embassy in Korea for 8 years and also headed the Korean Affairs Desk at the State Department in Washington, D.C. for several years. While serving with the U.S. Embassy, he had witnessed many turbulent political and social events in Korea, including assassination of President Park and also Gwangju uprising or incident. After retirement, he briefly taught at Johns Hopkins and also Seoul National University. He also was associated with the Stanford University Schoenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. He authored a book called Anti-Americanism in Democratizing South Korea, published by Stanford University. The copies, both in English and Korean version, are available for sales in the back. So, without further ado, let's welcome David Straub with a big round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Daejung, and I'd like to thank Brother Anthony and Tom Coiner and Young Hong and everyone at the Royal Asiatic Society for making this possible. These things take a lot of work, and so we all of us owe them a debt of gratitude. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here. I can see this is a rowdy group. But my goodness, you know, it's a beautiful, beautiful fall evening outside here in Seoul, and I was tempted myself when I was walking with Brother Anthony and Mr. John back from dinner just to stay out here on the patio and with a drink and enjoy the evening. But so, thank you very much for your interest in Korea. And I would also like to say it's a great honor and privilege to lecture at the Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch. It has a terrific history. So many brilliant people have stood here, and so it makes me feel very small, but also very grateful. So, anti-Americanism in South Korea. For those of you who lived here a long time continuously, you may have a notion of it. For those of you, how many of you have not been here more than 5 years, the last 5 years? Yeah, so quite a few, but most people have extensive experience. So many of you have saw some of this firsthand. But let me tell you just a little bit more about myself so you know where I'm coming from. As Mr. Daejung said, I came here as a second tour State Department officer in 1979. I was 25 years old. I studied a year of Korean at the State Department school just outside of Washington, D.C. I didn't know anything about anything and was just discovering how difficult the Korean language was and things like that. And then all hell broke loose here. Park was assassinated just up the street. Chun Doo-hwan began taking over as a general. Then we had the terrible events. We had massive protests in the spring of 1980, and then the Gwangju problems, and then Chun taking over completely. So that was quite an education for me, and I became fascinated by Korea. I continued to work at the embassy a couple of years in the political section, and I was the person who went around and talked with the so-called J.I.Insa, that is, the politicians who were forced out by President Chun. I also dealt with the student movement and some of the religious organizations that were active in the democratization movement. By the time I left in 1984 on a new assignment, I was really fatigued because at that time, Chun Doo-hwan was very unpopular. And as the person who was seeing people who disliked Chun most, every time I met a Korean, the argument was, the United States is all-powerful in Korea, omniscient in Korea, and therefore everything that's wrong with Korea is at least partly your fault. So I sympathized with that argument quite a bit initially, but after 2 years non-stop of hearing it, it became a little less persuasive to me. Anyway, so that brings me to the next time I came to work in Korea, which is the subject of this evening. After 15 years, I had recuperated and was ready to come back and try it again. Meanwhile, Korea had democratized, so there'd be no more of these difficulties, with everyone blaming the United States for all of these bad things happening. And I came in as the head of the political section, which is a pretty nice gig at the American Embassy. You have the ambassador, and you have the number 2, the deputy chief of mission, and you have, in those days, I got, 4 or 5 branches, political section, admin section, economic section, consular section, and the public affairs. So, and political affairs is not really that much about following Korean political affairs. It's dealing with the foreign ministry, dealing with the Ministry of Defense, and the U.S. Forces Korea, and some of the following the political parties. So it's quite an interesting job. And when I came, the opinion polls showed that Korean popular feeling toward the United States was as high as it had ever been. And so I was looking forward to a nice, easy, fun, cookie-pushing 3 years in Korea. It was not to be, as I will tell you a little bit more in a minute. During the period I was here, we had lots of demonstrations and lots of anger against the United States. And it was pretty traumatic for me because I was in a position that had to really work on this with the Korean government, Korean media, U.S. Forces Korea, and others. And it was very difficult, and in many ways I felt it didn't make sense to me, and it was kind of unfair. So when I finished up my tour in 2002, I said, I've got to write a book about this, because there's an American point of view about this that the Koreans have not heard. Because during this period, the Koreans were talking among themselves about all of these terrible things U.S. Forces Korea or the Americans in general were doing, and an American view was really not heard here. So I thought I could write a little bit about that. But I was still in the State Department, and so I was busy, and it's kind of awkward to write books like this when you're still in the State Department. So I finally left the State Department in 2006 and said, now I'll write my book. But for those of you who've worked in government, especially if you know the State Department, we're trained to write to busy bosses upstairs. So 1 page, no more. So I spent 25 or 30 years doing nothing but slices, cutting back on my own prose, and then when I was more senior and I was an editor, I would cut back on everybody else's. I got really good at removing adjectives and all sorts of verbiage. So when it came to write a book, 200 pages or something, I had a physical revulsion against writing that long, because I could have made the argument, in 10 pages if I'd done it in the State Department style. But this is sort of quasi-academic. You write by the pound. So it took me years and years just to overcome that. I finally, by the time I had missed my deadline for several years and I was going to lose my job and embarrass everybody involved, this is my last chance. So I sat down and wrote it in about 3 weeks. And then, of course, I had to rewrite it and stuff. But I wrote it fairly quickly, initially. And so that's why a book about anti-Americanism in Korea comes out in 2015 at a time when, again, Koreans are among the most pro-American in the world, because after I left, maybe because I left, they went, things went way up. So it made me wonder why I'd gone to the trouble. But anyway, I did write it, and people helped me to get it published. And then I'm very grateful for our Korean publisher. Sancheram is a very distinguished Korean publisher, and we have Sancheram's representative, Yang Yun-mi, is here. Yun Yang-mi. Is Yun Yang-mi here? Yes. Please give a round of applause to somebody who worked very hard this year. And she's done, it's done a beautiful job. The cover is great. The translation is excellent, and so I'm very, very grateful to Ms. Young. And also, she gave it a really good title. The title, Anti-Americanism and Democratizing South Korea, is probably in the running for the worst title ever for a book, but it was imposed upon me. The Korean title is much more active. So tonight, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about what's in the book, and some of my experiences and thoughts about anti-American feeling in South Korea. And since many of you have lived here much longer than I have, and during periods especially when I was not here, I'm really looking forward to the discussions. I'll try to speak fairly briefly so we can have more discussion tonight. And to put this in context, I think this subject fits in very well with a couple of recent briefings we've had on current and contemporary Korean history. We had Michael Green talking about minshim, or popular feeling, and this is quite closely related to this. In fact, he talked about a few of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight as well. And then we had Dr. David Fields, who came and talked about his research about the 1882 U.S. treaty normalizing relations, or establishing relations with Korea, and Dr. Seung Ri and his activities, and how that inadvertently contributed to the division of Korea. So this fits together with them somewhat. Okay, but I will try to make this fairly brief and make it a little bit interactive at the risk of causing trouble for our videographer. But I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but basically I'm just going to use it to get things kicked off.
No, not that one. This one. Should be working down. Is it? Not working.
I'll just use this. This will get it. So, how many of you know these two young ladies? Yeah, most of you. These are the two middle school students, Shin Hyo-sun and Shin Mi-sun, who died very tragically in a traffic accident when they were run over by a U.S. Forces Korea vehicle during an exercise in 2002. And the events ensuing caused the biggest anti-American demonstrations here, I guess, ever at the end of 2002. And how many of you know this person? Okay. Makes my point. So these two young ladies were killed in an accident. It was a terrible accident. It was nothing more than an accident, but caused hundreds of thousands of South Koreans to come out into the streets and demonstrate against the United States week after week after week in 2002. This is Major David Berry, and he was a U.S. Army pediatrician, and he came to Korea in the summer of 2000 after this wave of anti-Americanism had really already gotten started. The media was full of criticism of the U.S., especially of U.S. Forces Korea. And Major Berry was assigned here during the summer, I think, to fill a staffing gap at the hospital or something like that. And as this young pediatrician was walking down Itaewon with a couple of his friends, a Korean man lunged at him and stabbed him with the knife and killed him. The Korean man apparently was deranged. He said that David had said something derogatory to him. Maybe he was homeless or something. I don't know. But anyway, he killed him. He died right away. And there was one Yonhap Wire story about that big. It was a great story. It said, quoted the deranged man as saying that, oh, he said bad things to me, that's why I attacked him, as if that were credible. Didn't quote his friends who said he never said a word to him. And there was not another word in Korea about this. Not another word. Now, I wouldn't mention this if it was just a deranged man. But as we know from the United States and other countries, deranged people are deeply affected by the culture in which they live. I have very little doubt that the man who killed him was affected by all the anti-Americanism in the media and on the streets during this period that had begun in 1999. Yet, Americans paid no attention to this. Koreans certainly paid no attention to this. I've introduced a term in the book called asymmetry of attention. By that I mean asymmetry of public attention to the U.S. ROK alliance. South Koreans know and are interested a lot in the United States and the U.S. ROK alliance. Far fewer Americans know about Korea, and very few Americans are, know very much or very interested in the workings of the alliance. So this person was basically, his death was basically ignored. It didn't, essentially for Koreans, it didn't happen. How many of you know this fellow? Everybody, right? This is Psy from Gangnam Style. Okay? How many of you know what this is all about? Several. So this was Psy in 2002 after the girls were killed by something that, well, it didn't look like that, but it was a tracked vehicle. There was so much anger in South Korea at the United States over that incident and other things that went before it, that Psy, a young entertainer on the make, he got on stage and did a skit in which, the Americans are running over Koreans with tanks. Now, how many of you are familiar with this? Several, yeah. This came out, or Psy sang this at a concert in 2004, 2 years after all of these events, when the anti-American feelings were dying down here. This is pretty rough stuff. This is in response partially to the Iraq thing. Of course, I don't know, when did Gangnam Style become a big hit? Anyway, much later. And he was really big in the United States and all over the world, and he was coming to the States and feeling great. And then somebody went back and found this. And his PR people went nuts. And they quickly put out an apology saying, if I offended anybody, and I only did this because it was in the middle of, everybody was upset about Iraq. So he was going to move quickly, and he did. Okay. How many of you remember the controversy over President Kim's first meeting with President Bush? Many of you, most of you, okay. You may remember that the two men, President Kim had gone to North Korea for the first ever and only, at the time, North-South Korean summit. He came back saying peace is at hand. He won a Nobel Prize. And then George W. Bush was elected in, the end of 2000. And President Kim knows that President Bush is kind of hostile towards North Korea, so he wants to go and persuade him to support his sunshine policy. So he rushes there, and just a couple of months after Bush is elected, in March, and they have a meeting. And Bush listens to him politely enough, but he doesn't agree with his North Korea policy because President Bush, frankly, doesn't believe it makes sense. President Bush, once referring to President Kim, said, "This man." which after a day or so suddenly became a huge thing in Korea, because people started saying, this man, 이 사람, which is literally this person, but in Korean it has a very negative connotation. So this became a very big deal, and if you talk with Korean friends and colleagues to this day, and even if they're at think tanks or whatever, if you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, Bush really went too far to get me calling our president this man. Now, how many of you believe that in calling President Kim this man, that was reflecting President Bush's feelings, true feelings toward President Kim, and that those were disrespectful? Please, your frank opinions. Most South Koreans would say yes. Everyone is afraid. Okay. Well, this, I told you it made Koreans very upset. So, very famous Korean politician. Is he still in the assembly? Anyway, he's been around for a long time, very distinguished looking gentleman. He was vice speaker then. He sent a letter. He said he was going to send a letter to Bush, and I think he did, condemning him for that blunt gesture of calling President Kim this man. And Mr. Holmes said he had checked with close American friends, and they told him that, yeah, such a term verges on the casual. And my friend Mike Chinoy, whom many of you know, used to be CNN's East Asia correspondent, very nice person, sharp, great journalist, a scholar. He wrote this book called Meltdown about North Korea policy and differences between the U.S. and South Korea. And this is a paragraph from his book. He says, Bush started off the press conference by referring to Kim Daejung as this man, a casual reference. Possibly, these are my boldface, possibly indicating he had forgotten Kim's name and chose not to refer to his title, which South Koreans found offensive. And years later, when I, Mike Chinoy, interviewed Kim Daejung, the memory still rankled. He humiliated me by calling me this man. So I think that's after Kim stepped down from the presidency. He still, as an old man, is still angry about this. Now, here is what President Bush said in context. And by the way, I'm not here to defend President Bush. I left the government because of President Bush. I did not like him at all as president, and I did not like most of his foreign policy. So I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because I'm hoping just a little bit to help correct the historical record. So President Bush said, everybody in? It's been my honor to welcome President Kim here to the Oval Office. We had a very good discussion. We confirmed a close relation and so on and so forth. How much I appreciate this man's leadership in terms of reaching out to the North Koreans. He is leading. He is a leader. I'm looking forward. I don't know if I sound like Bill Clinton or George Bush. So he says, frankly, somewhere here he says, frankly, that, I'm a little skeptical about North Korea. But anyway, but that's not going to preclude us. He actually used the word preclude, from trying to achieve common objectives. Okay, now, so you see what the context is. Now, is this use of this man offensive? So I'm going to try, let's see.
Just click on it.
Just click on it. Okay, is it casual?
You may want to use the mouse.
Mouse, okay. Now, I just pulled this off the internet just because of the language. I have no idea who this wonderful couple is.
And do you, Sister Patrice, think this man?
Okay. Now, I put in the book, when I married my Korean bride, we had a marriage here, a ceremony, then we went a couple months later, as many people do, and did one again in the States for family there. The minister there said the same thing to me. And I hope my wife was not thinking, he's haram. Was it humiliating? Now, how many of you know this fellow who just recently was forced out of the White House? Gorka, who's... So he really loves Trump, right? He was forced out of Trump's White House, but he says Trump is the stuff, and he's going to help Trump more on the outside than he did when he was there. So he's having this argument with this journalist who really wants to go after him. And I think it's...
And Sebastian Gorka joins us now live from to the Make America. He didn't lift a finger to unstoppable. The fact that we have entrenched interests for decades in this city is just a reality that we're going to deal with.
This is all contradictory. You're saying he's not in control, and that the people around him pushed out the great supporters like you and Steve Bannon. Yeah, you're saying he's unstoppable. He clearly is stoppable because people like you have been pushed out.
Not at all. This is going to be an 8-year presidency, and we're only in the 8th month. I mean, are you really so facile in your understanding of politics that you think the MAGA agenda is going to take 8 months to realize?
Well, you're the one who's saying it's being undermined, and the people who are against it are in the ascendant.
No, I'm saying that you're not listening. I said the MAGA agenda inside the building.
My apologies, I misread my time
But that's
cue
just
here.
part of it. I mean, you do
Anyway.
know how many people voted for the president.
He's talking about Trump, and he said, I'm gonna help this man on the outside.
Electoral college system, that's how our democracy and our...
You can trust me on that. Now, finally, this is my coup de grace. Remember when Joe Biden, Uncle Joe, decided he was not going to run for president last year, and he kept everybody in suspense, and finally he says, I'm going to give a speech telling you what I'm going to do. And he comes out and he spends 45 minutes saying what I would have done had I run for president. And again, let me see where this is at. So at the very end, my apologies, folks, for not being... Anyway, at the very end, this is what Joe Biden says. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with this man, Obama, standing right there. So I guarantee you, if you go out tomorrow and you talk to your Korean colleagues and you say, tell me about this man, 9 out of 10 of them, maybe 99 out of 100 will say, Bush personally disrespected Kim Daejung and humiliated him. I give this because this is a great illustration of the fact that there's not enough balance in the public relationship between the American side of the alliance and the Korean side of the alliance. Koreans focus on the U.S. much more than Americans focus on Korea. And therefore, most of the talk that the Koreans have about the alliance is among Koreans themselves. And so Koreans are not native American English speakers. And so if this man is Isaram, it's fairly natural that people think, oh, this is problematic. But if there were a lot more dialogue going on, that would not have been sustained. And we have lots of other examples. I'll give you a few more during this talk. So, my book has this table of contents. I have basically an introductory chapter and a concluding chapter. The introductory chapter sets the stage. I try to talk a little bit about the history of U.S. Korean relationships, a little bit about the origins of anti-Americanism. And then at the end, or I should say that these chapters in the middle are all case studies of controversial issues in the U.S.-ROK alliance during this period that I worked here from 1999 to 2002. And the final chapter tries to tie all that together, gives my interpretation of why these incidents happened the way they did, and speculates a little bit about whether we might have more anti-Americanism in South Korea in the future. So it's fairly simple in that regard. But what am I talking about when I say anti-Americanism? Well, unlike the PhD students here, like Jacob and others, I'm not forced to define terms, and I looked, and there's no agreed definition of what anti-Americanism is. I know it when I see it, and people often disagree. So I just basically said, for want of anything better, that if this group of people or this people in this state treat another state or people of that state different than they would others in the same circumstances, and negatively so, then that's kind of that was good enough for my purposes. One of the very interesting things that I've found, and I'm sure many of you too have found, is that you'll find very, very few Koreans, even then, who would be willing to say, oh, I'm anti-American. They would say, no, I'm not anti-American. I'm just critical of American policies. You guys have terrible policies, but I'm not anti-American. What it reminds me of is nothing so much as in the United States, there's a significant percentage of Americans who are racist. And yet today in the United States, being racist is politically taboo. And people have internalized it. You'll find almost no Americans who would not only would be willing to say, but even believe in their heart of hearts that they're racist. No. They say, I'm not racist. I just believe that black people should work just as hard as we do if they expect, to live well and stuff like that. So it's similar to that. And you'll find very sophisticated Koreans, even to this day, who say about periods like 1999 to 2002, no, I'm not anti-American. You guys were just being awful. You were treating us awful. But if the Americans maybe weren't really treating Koreans awful, and Koreans were treating the Americans as if they were treating them awful, there's some prejudice and anti in that, in my opinion. Now, the other thing about the content of my book is I focused on one specific kind of anti-Americanism. And that's because of where I was at the time at the American Embassy. So I was focused on the anti-Americanism that centered around the alliance relationship itself. I mean, you could, like in every other country, you'll be able to find Koreans who say, I think American popular culture is just horrible, or I had one of our members here works for a brilliant Korean man who's worked on the front lines of U.S. Korean relations for decades, and he took me very kindly, he read my book, and very kindly took me to lunch and said, yeah, it's okay, but really anti-Americanism in Korea is all about the economy. If you look at opinion polls, Koreans are always more interested in the economy and trade relations than they are anything else, including in presidential elections. And if you look at things that Koreans over the decades have been most angry at the United States about, at a basic level, it's been U.S. trade policy. Anytime the U.S. has been tough on Korea on trade, it's made Koreans really mad. And he has a point. Opinion polls do show something like that. But, maybe it's just because I've never worked on economic issues, and because that's fairly common all over the world, that didn't really interest me, and maybe I downplay it too much. But I think the really more important strain of anti-Americanism in Korea is historical and ideologically based. And it centers around South Koreans' concept of their own country, the establishment of the Republic of Korea as a divided state, and how to look on North Korea and how to look on the United States and other quote-unquote great powers. And that I think is the nub of it that's important for the alliance. So, as I said, in chapter 1, I talk a little bit about the history and the setting for this period, 1999 to 2002. And, most of you, even those of you who've been here not so long, you've read about the history of Korea and seen a lot of the world. So you know that over the past 100 years, especially in earlier decades, there was a great deal of Western racism against Koreans. Koreans have every right to have been very upset about that. Korea was also a victim of great powers, and I don't think they were as much a victim of the United States as a great power as many imagine, but they certainly were of Japan and the competition Japan had with Russia and China. So Koreans still have a sense of being victims. Koreans, at least until recently, also had a very, very strong sense of ethnic nationalism. When I first came to Korea, and you know, or maybe just before I came, and heard Danyo Minjok, single race nation or something, as a liberal in a sense, that bothered me a great deal. It seemed to me as an American whale at the top, even though I could understand it as a defensive mechanism because of all that the South Koreans had suffered in the previous century. I'm happy to see that that is much, much reduced in Korea over the past 10, 15 years. But as recently as 10 years ago, it had not disappeared. All of you remember in 2007, the student at Virginia Tech, Daejung. I mean, a terribly sad case. We've seen scores of cases like that in the United States. Essentially, a mentally ill young person with access to guns. It's an American ailment. And he killed, I don't know what it was, a couple dozen people or so. It was just horrible. And I happened to be back in Korea at the time at Seoul National University teaching one quarter, or one semester. And there, for those of you who were here, you'll remember, Koreans were terrified that Americans on the street were going to go out and kill Koreans in the United States. They thought that Koreans would stop getting visas at the American embassy in retaliation. They thought that, I think the FTA was either signed or anyway, something with the FTA would not go forward. The then Korean ambassador to Washington seriously proposed that Korean Americans do a fast a day, every day or something for all the people who were killed. The president of South Korea got on the phone, I believe it was, and called the president of the United States to apologize. And I kept telling my Korean friends, Americans are not going to think like that. We've had too many of these cases. We know because this boy grew up in the United States. He's not Korean. He had Korean citizenship. He hadn't gotten American citizenship. But culturally, he was an American. And he's mentally ill. So I kept telling my wife, and I have a little anecdote, a footnote in this book, you know. I went with my wife's high school classmate. Her husband took us on a long trip over to the East Coast, beautiful. And my wife and friends started saying, oh, you Americans are going to kill us all. And I said, no, it's not. Nobody's going to get killed. That's not the way Americans think about this. And I said I ruined a perfectly good weekend because of the thought. But gradually, over the next week or two, nothing happened in the United States. And gradually the Korean media picked up and said, some said, we were wrong. Maybe we were ascribing the way we look at ethnic nationalism to the Americans, and maybe not everybody in the world looks at things the same way that we do. And a few said in the media, and maybe that helps to explain some of our reaction in 2002 after the girls were killed. I looked briefly at some of the historical reasons for anti-Americanism. You know, there are arguments that the U.S. was responsible for not stopping Japan from colonizing Korea and other things that really quite, I won't get into those tonight, but are quite misguided. They don't really understand the world situation or the role of the United States at that time. Gwangju is much different, and we had, I think, Michael Green talked some about Gwangju. Gwangju had a big effect on the younger, now 40, 50-year-olds in Korea. When they were young people and saw the things that happened as Chundu-won took power and as so many people killed in Gwangju, and there was this very widespread perception that the United States could have stopped Chun Doo-hwan from coming to power, could have stopped things in Gwangju, which we can talk about it more if we want to, but having been in the embassy as a very junior officer at the time, it's just nonsense. The United States was not in Korea to be the sovereign over the Korean government. The American ambassador and the American military commander viewed their role as doing everything possible to prevent North Korea from attacking South Korea again. And we now know, this was 1979, 1980, we know now that around 1975, Kim Il-sung, as Vietnam was falling, went again to Beijing and said, I'd like to try the Korean War again. And fortunately, by this time, the Chinese had actually, unlike Kim, had learned something. He said, no, we're not going to help you do this. So this is 4 years before the North Koreans are still ready to attack South Korea and invade it. So that's what the Americans were focused on. And they weren't going to, insert themselves into Korea and try to become, in fact, the sovereign in Korea. So this brings us up to my arrival in Korea in 1999. And as I said, the polls were good, and things were looking fine in U.S. Korean relation terms. And then, just entirely coincidentally, in the fall of 1999, AP, a wire service, read a story about American soldiers killing a lot of South Koreans in the first few days of the Korean War at a place called Nogun-ni. And it's a horrible story. Exactly what happened is not clear, and we'll never know because it's lost in the fog of war and so forth. But it was terrible. And there were some other incidents in which civilians were killed, especially by bombers and things like that, but almost all in the first weeks and months of the war. But this had a tremendous impact in South Korea. To me, and this is my interpretation, I may be wrong, but I'm not sure that we would have had the terrific surge in anti-Americanism that we had for the next 3 years if that had not been there as a catalyst. Because the headlines that this story generated, the columns and the commentaries, were entitled something like, "What does America really mean to us?" So this was a reinterpretation of the U.S.-ROK alliance and of the United States, especially by the younger generation, the 386 generation affected by Gwangju and their interpretation of that. And that, but there was another thing that happened, which was at the end of 1997, Kim Daejung was elected president. And Don Kirk, who's back here, has written a really good book about Kim Daejung that everybody should read. He very insightfully notes that Kim Daejung's focus was on this North Korea thing. He really wasn't very interested in security issues of the alliance. His real focus was on North Korea. And he was supported very much by people on the left. And when he came to power, those people on the left, for the very first time in ROK history, felt empowered. And his government also helped finance some of these left-wing NGOs, some of which were quite anti-American, some of which were clearly hoping to help force the U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. And so they became very, very active at this period. And also the South Korean journalists, the reporting people, the people of younger age, they were quite critical of the United States. And so they took Nogun-ni and what it meant to Koreans about the United States, and they ran with it. So over the next 3 years, we had one big controversy after another about the United States, most involving U.S. forces Korea. And these are not nearly all of them. I just put the more interesting ones or some that I was involved with. All of these are involved with U.S. forces Korea, except this one, which was the controversy between President Kim and President No on the one hand and President Bush on the other. And this one was about the Apollo Ono short track controversy, the sporting event. Okay? Just to give you just a flavor of a few of these. In Chapter 3, formaldehyde incident. How many of you have heard of the movie The Host, or in Korean, Daejung? Yes. That's about that incident, or it's based on it. It's a fantasy story. The head of the mortuary down at USFK, gung-ho guy, he found some old bottles of formaldehyde used in embalming. It was no longer useful, dusty. He told his Korean staff, dump that stuff down the drain, we don't need it anymore, let's clean this place up. Now in those days, on the backs of formaldehyde, it said they'd be diluted in water and disposed of in the drain. But those were old bottles. By that time, South Korean regulations didn't allow that way of disposing of it, nor did USFK regulations. So one or more of his disgruntled employees went to one of these left-wing NGOs, and they had a big announcement. And the headlines were, "The Americans are poisoning our water. They're trying to kill us." Huge story. Now, the fact of the matter is, shouldn't have happened. It's a violation of not only Korean law, but also USFK regulation, and he was punished somewhat for it. But it was not a threat to the health of people, because it is, once it does dissolve in water, especially in any amount, it's not dangerous. And by the way, same USFK personnel also drank the same water that the people of Seoul were drinking, okay? So if it's a problem, okay, but it's not going to kill you. And by the way, the Americans were as exposed as you were too. Didn't make any difference. And every time the Americans tried to explain the argument that the Korean media and the NGOs would say, "You're trying to kill us, and you have this, you're shameless enough to say, to try to make excuses for it? How dare you?" And that was as far as we ever got. So this was the environment that the embassy and USFK had to deal with over the 2 years in terms of the public relations environment. I'll tell you one more anecdote about this one. I was so frustrated because, I couldn't always feel that USFK was giving me the straight story, and I certainly didn't believe the Korean media, and I knew the Korean media would not allow other voices or not. Other people who were scientific experts in Korea were frightened to say, no, it's not that bad. So you saw almost no stories in the Korean media saying, don't worry, it's okay. You did later, 3 or 4 years ago, after that, when Korean companies dumped tons of this stuff in the water, they said, it's okay, it's diluted. So I'm trying to figure out how bad is this? Is it really serious for health? So the internet was not very useful in those days. So finally I got in the Yellow Pages, and there was a Chosun-ilbo, a pro-American conservative newspaper's editorial said, "Would the Americans dump formaldehyde in the Potomac River?" So I called a coroner who worked near the Potomac River. And I said, "You don't know me, but I work here, and this is the situation, and I need you to tell me, frankly, what do Americans do? How do you dispose of this formaldehyde?" And the guy obviously didn't know me from Adam and didn't know what I was about. But finally said, "Well, yeah, sometimes we'll throw a little in the drain, but dilute it well." So yes, we do dispose of it in the Potomac River, Chosun-ilbo. Kuni Range. That's where we had a bombing range near the village of Daejung over the Yellow Sea. The activist down there who was trying to get the U.S. to stop using that as a bombing range around his village was, well, I better not say it in public. But anyway, there was an incident in which an American plane was having mechanical difficulties in following standard operating procedures. The pilot, for safety reasons, dropped 6 live bombs on the far side of the island. Now the island is about 1.5 miles or 2 miles off the coast. So for any of you who've been in the military, you know the idea that that could cause any damage to the village 2 miles away is just nuts. And yet this activist came out and said hundreds of old people were injured, and cows miscarried, and we had hundreds of houses had cracks in the foundations, and the windows all broke. And the Korean media reported that without any questioning. It's stunning. I give many, many quotes in the book. And so they said, you have to have, the editorial said, you have to have a joint investigation, this must end. So we had a joint USFK MND, Ministry of National Defense investigation, and sure enough, there's zero damage from this. This is just ridiculous. So the head of the American side is a hard-headed fighter pilot, Major General Mike Dunn, and he said, well, to his colleague, the Korean general, said, well, we know what we put in the report, and no damage. And the Korean general said, but if we say that, I know it's the case, but if we say that, we're just going to be killed. Well, we have to, phrase it nicely and allow that there may be some damage. I don't know what he said, but it's probably something along those lines. But Dunn, as a straight shooter, said, no, I'm not going to put my signature on that. So they gave the report just as they had found it. And the Korean media was furious because they had been going on for weeks that, this terrible thing had happened and the Americans were shameless. And they said, okay, you guys, you Americans, you just don't get it. It's not just what you did this time. It's what you've been doing to us for the last 30 years. That's a hard argument to beat. Okay. SOFA. I'm not going to have time to talk about it. Let's see. Yeah, we need to finish up in a little bit. SOFA is a really, really important issue, probably less important now than it was then. If you're one of those people who believe that the U.S. Korea SOFA is fundamentally unfair to the Korean people, I hope you look at the book sometime to see my argument that it's not. I've already talked a little bit about the disagreement between the two governments over North Korea policy, which had some impact on anti-Americanism, but I don't think it was all that much, because as time went by, Koreans became more and more skeptical of the Sunshine Policy themselves. Chapter 6 is about the short track racing scandal, or controversy. And by the way, this chapter was written not by me. This is the only chapter I did not write. When I was at Seoul National University in 2007, one of my students at the graduate school there, John Slack, an American, wrote this beautiful paper about this. And I thought, since I don't know anything about sports, much less short track racing, this would be great to show another angle. So with just small changes, we put his paper in this book. And I learned a great deal from it. And unless you're a real sports fan, you will learn something too. Basically, Koreans had not won anything in Winter Olympics until short track was put in as a regular Winter Olympic sports, and the Koreans went great guns. They were going up in the top 10 because of this. And then a Japanese American kid named Apollo Ono, was involved in a disputed call, and Korean sports fans in particular went nuts about it. And I put it in here because it's an important issue. It had a huge impact on the way Koreans looked at the United States. They were incredibly angry. The cyber attacks were launched on numerous U.S. media and other organizations by South Koreans over this. There were at least 40 death threats issued by Koreans against Apollo Ono, and so on and so forth. Big deal, and a very interesting episode. And the final case study is about this terrible traffic accident that killed the two girls. I put in the book, but I remember very vividly. I was working in the office there on the 8th floor of the embassy, and I got a phone call from Evans Revere, who was the number 2 at the time. And Evans apparently had just gotten a phone call from U.S. Forces Korea saying this accident happened. He told me. I said, oh, how horrible, how sad. And he said, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be awful. And I said, oh, surely not. I mean, it's a horrible thing, but it was an accident. It's not like, that terrible rape of the little schoolgirl in Okinawa some years before, something like that. No, he said, this is going to be terrible. And basically what happened is, within the first day, the American Embassy and U.S. Forces Korea started issuing apologies. compensation money to the family. We had candlelight church services. U.S. forces regular personnel don't earn a lot of money, gave of their own money to give donations to the family. This all happened in the first 24 hours, first couple of weeks. Koreans were not paying attention. This was when the 2002 World Cup soccer, hosted in Japan and Korea, was on, and Koreans, you know, the Red Devils were great, and it was great fun, and everybody was completely focused on this. As soon as that ended, the media and some of these NGOs became focused on this. And they paid no attention to the fact that we'd already done all of the things that they started demanding that we do. And anytime we made new apologies or anything else, any other gestures we made, that was, no, it's insincere. We don't believe it. And so this went on. We had a court-martial for the two men to see if they were negligent. The verdict was not guilty. Of course, the Korean media, as one, including the conservative so-called pro-American media, said, we knew it. These are Americans trying Americans who killed Koreans. Of course they don't give a damn about this. And so the last couple of months we had huge demonstrations. And in the background was the South Korean presidential election. And Roh Moo-hyun was the progressive candidate. He was famously anti-American, had called for the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea 10 years before. Basically, he didn't say anything. He didn't participate in the candlelight protest. He didn't have to. Everybody assumed they knew what his position was. But the conservative pro-American candidate, Daejung, became so fearful that he was going to lose, and rightfully so, that he called in the American ambassador in front of all the media and did this really offensive, obnoxious browbeating of the American ambassador over this issue. But he still lost. 49 to 47%, 2% difference. And in opinion polls, 20% of Koreans said that their vote was affected by this traffic accident. 11% said concerns about North Korea affected their vote. So it may very well have been that this traffic accident caused Roh Moo-hyun to be elected at that time. And then it was over. Within 2 or 3 weeks after Roh was elected, the protest stopped. And there are many reasons for that, but primarily, I think the storyline had reached an end. You know, for 3 years, Korean media have been going after the United States. That's a long time. If you remember, the campaign against Japan ended at the end of 2015 with the agreement between President Park. It had been going on for at least 3 years. And that's a long time, so people get bored of that kind of a storyline. And in this case, the story had an ending. And the happy ending was the progressive, the anti-American, Roh Moo-hyun, had won. And partly because we Koreans righteously went out on the streets and told the Americans that we won't take this any longer. And then President Roh, even before he was inaugurated, his focus was on North Korea. He really wanted to take up the Sunshine Policy and make progress in North-South relations. He didn't want problems with the United States. He wanted George W. Bush to support, or at least not oppose, his North Korea policy. And so he went down to USFK and said, you guys are just great. He said, the alliance is precious. Told the Koreans, you know, please, you know, you can criticize the US, but calm it down and stuff like that. So this ended the main protest. And within a year or so, the polls started showing that anti-Americanism to be going way down. And in part, that's because the focus was now not on pretend to be able to forecast the future. I hope we never see anything like we saw in 1999, 2002. I think one reason we probably won't is because Koreans today are much, much more cosmopolitan than they were. I've been stunned to come back and live here this year after being away for 10 years at how much progress Koreans have made and how much more cosmopolitan and knowledgeable they are. I mean, it's because they you know, when I first came here, they weren't allowed to tour. And now Koreans travel all over the world. They're the most plugged in the world. They have more PhDs than any population in the world. So I'm less worried about Koreans today than I am about my own people. Thank you very much.
Mr. Trump can entertain a few questions from the floor.
Thank you, David, for giving us a good overview of your book. You still buy a copy of it. You briefly mentioned at the end, you briefly compared this arc, this anti-American arc to the anti-Japanese arc, and I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that. In 2002, I was studying I was at a lab in Yonsei, and I remember the student government or some student organization in front of the Yonsei Jungmun had draped two enormous flags, the American flag and the Japanese flag side by side. And it was draped so wide that you had to walk across one of them in order to get into campus. So you had your choice. Did you want to walk across the American flag or the Japanese flag? And so at the time, I didn't understand the comparison. You know, I didn't understand. I still don't fully understand kind of the, you know, again, is it just the motif of these are two great powers that have, you know, done harm to South Korea in the past or something. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the parallels between anti-American sentiment and anti-Japanese sentiment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, almost all Koreans, even to this day, have negative feelings about the history of, you know, Japan's history toward them, and Japan at large. But on the left side in Korea, there is this sense that the U.S. came in and took over from the Japanese, continued to use a lot of Koreans who had been Japanese collaborators to run the government and to set up the Republic of Korea. So there, on the left side in Korea, there's still a lot of complex feelings about the very foundation of the Republic of Korea. Now, these days, you're not going to find hardly anybody sane in South Korea would say, oh, you know, we don't support the Republic of Korea. But there's still, you know, this is an alternative history that they wish had happened differently. And so, and of course, the United States over the decades, almost since the founding of the Republic of Korea, because that coincided with the Cold War, the U.S. has tried to encourage Japan to do more to help the U.S. on security in East Asia, and has tried to get the Koreans to be more supportive of that, and to get them to work together with the Japanese bilaterally and trilaterally. And even to this day, that is very much resisted, as you know. So I think that comes much more from the left, to say these America and Japan go together than anything else. Anyway, it's too complex to get into more than that, but I'm still learning it myself. And you have to be careful because you don't want to, you know, tar people with, you know, some sort of an ideological brush. But it is a complicated history, and there are real elements to it.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I was actually about to ask pretty much the same question, extended, if I may. We're seeing significant bilateral issues between China and South Korea now. Do you see a time when we might see protests outside the Chinese embassy rather than Japanese and American?
Will there be protests outside the Chinese embassy? You know, I've been thinking about this over the past few months because I get lots of questions here while I'm living in Korea about Donald Trump. And we had all of these problems with Korean attitudes toward the U.S., Korean protests against the United States during this period. And of course, half of this period that I'm talking about, Bill Clinton was the president. He worked really, really hard in his last 2 years to try to do what the Koreans wanted in response to this, and including on North Korea policy, worked very close. And Koreans got very upset with Bush about the way he allegedly treated President Kim, and there were all kinds of protests. And then I compare that, with what some of the things Donald Trump has said, and some of the policy decisions he's made that affect South Korea, and it's like very little coming publicly from the South Koreans. And I think it's because, this is a headline I gave the Washington Post, they worry he's kind of nuts. They don't know exactly what he's going to do, and they figure that protesting is not going to help, it just make him set him off again. So everybody's, the media, government officials, think tank people, everybody is being extraordinarily reticent about some of these outrageous things that he's saying and doing. And it reminded me of China over the past decade or two, and especially with the THAAD deployment. Some of the things the Chinese have done to the South Koreans, I just imagine if the U.S. had, I mean, it's inconceivable. And why? And I think it's because and I don't mean this to be critical, it's kind of common sense. South Koreans look at China and say, this is an enormous, huge country next door, and they're not going to listen to us. And if we protest, it's just going to make it worse. So we better keep our head low. I think that is still the situation. I know from 7 months here now that the way that China has punished South Korea over the American THAAD deployment here has had a profound impact on the elite thinking, and I would guess on many ordinary Koreans, and the way that they look at China and say, what does China really mean to us? By the way, I just got back from Beijing this afternoon, and we talked with some think tank people there, and I didn't want to get in a fight with them about THAAD because I feel sort of like the South Koreans about it, but I said, I've been living here, and you really cost yourself with the South Koreans over this. By the way, I'm not very good with arithmetic, but I'm pretty sure that in dollar terms, the Chinese have already cost the South Koreans more in 1 year of economic retribution over them allowing the Americans to deploy a THAAD unit to defend against North Korea's missiles than the sanctions value amount of the Chinese sanctions against North Korea for having those missiles for the past 10 years. It's pretty outrageous. But, so, to answer your question, not yet, but I think probably more important, if the Chinese continue this kind of crazy, outrageous approach, that it will take the glacier or the iceberg or something and start moving it, or the aircraft carrier of the Korean state away from China. So far, the Koreans have just looked only at the opportunities China has offered and have not thought much about the risk, and now they're thinking about the risk. So I think we may see more of Korean investment leaving China and going to other places, and things like that for the mid to long term.
Somewhat following up on your last response, do you think that there could be sort of an anti-American reaction to all the pressure that's being placed on the President Moon's administration to hew to a rather tough line vis-a-vis North Korea? And how will his popularity ratings bear up if this pressure increases? Right now we think it sort of looks like a leftist-led reaction, but could it become a broader reaction of the sort that you've described in previous years?
It's a good question, Don, and I've been trying to think about it myself. I don't think we can know yet. I think it depends so much about what President Trump will eventually say and do. And then, of course, it depends also fundamentally on what President Kim will do. And I guess if I sat down, maybe with you or some others over a beer later, we could come out with some scenarios in which, South Koreans could say, we can't rely on the United States anymore for various reasons. We're not there yet. And in fact, one of the things that surprised me on coming back here is how I think Koreans are clinging even closer to the U.S. now than they were before, because they see that, you know, and maybe as difficult as the U.S. can be with them sometimes, that China, Russia, North Korea, and from their perspective, Japan, are even worse. And I think that's why I would guess that President Moon feels pretty conflicted and feels really sandwiched between what he would like to do, which is probably try to dialogue more and give the North Koreans more humanitarian aid, at least initially, and what President Trump is trying to do, which is a 100% focus on pressure until the North Koreans are willing to negotiate seriously. So I'm sure there are some significant tensions in the official relationship, but both sides are, I'm happy to say, are doing a pretty good job of trying to keep those private. But it will depend on what happens in the future, whether or not that will remain the case.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, kind of going back to 2002 with the height of the anti-American protests, and having Kim Daejung and Roh Moo-hyun as the president, was there any discussion with the U.S. Embassy or on the South Korean side about having a referendum about the U.S. troop presence? Because it seems like that was kind of the root cause of the anger at the U.S., then it seems like that would have been good cover both from our end to say, like, well, do you really want us here, or for them as well?
That's a very interesting question. And I briefly discussed it at the end of the book, but one of the reasons the protests suddenly went down so much, in addition to the steps that President No took after he was elected, was the then U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had this plan to be able to move U.S. forces anywhere in the world, anywhere else in the world at a moment's notice. And he knew he couldn't do that with South Korea forces, U.S. forces in South Korea, because the South Koreans would be worried if U.S. forces suddenly left and weren't there to help in a contingency. But so Donald Rumsfeld made plans to start reducing significantly what few American forces we still had then. And we informed President No confidentially. And he was very, very concerned about this because I think he understood that he would be blamed by the Korean people if the Americans started withdrawing the troops. Because, you know, even though the feelings then were still very raw against the U.S. and especially U.S. forces Koreans didn't really, most Koreans didn't really want those forces to go. So yeah, if we had said, okay, if you don't want us, we're willing, you know, if you have an opinion poll and it shows you want us to go, we'll go. That would have probably, you know, I mean, that we would never have done that for various reasons, but what had the same effect was when Don Rumsfeld actually started withdrawing troops, and it caused a panic here in South Korea across the spectrum.
So last question.
Mr. Trump, thank you for your interesting, informative talk. I have a question concerning U.S. ambassador to Korea. I think Koreans were very pleased and surprised when Ambassador Catherine Stevens were appointed to Korea, followed by Ambassador Sung Kim. And I understand now that Victor Cha got nominated to be ambassador to Korea.
Well, I don't have inside information, but what I have heard is that he is the choice to become the next ambassador, but it has not been announced, and I gather that, you know, they're doing the routine security check, which can take some time.
I think many Koreans are very pleased that the U.S. government is paying attention to appoint ambassadors who have some connections to Korea or Korean parents. And I think this will promote the relationship and perhaps ameliorate the perhaps some anti-U.S. feelings. And I think it's a good step. And so, having said that, have you experienced were there some difficulties in having ambassadors who were more close to Korea, performing their job as ambassadors to Korea. So difficult things.
You mean having Korean Americans as ambassadors? Or is it?
Yeah, Korean Americans who are even more ties to Korea, Ambassador
Oh.
Stevens.
No, I mean, you know, ideally, an American ambassador here would have some significant knowledge and experience in Korea. So that has almost always been a positive thing. For example, Kathy is a friend of mine, and I think she was liked by the Korean people probably more than any American ambassador. And so that's worked very well. There was some controversy decades ago in the United States about appointing people to ambassadorial positions in the countries of their heritage. But so when I first came here in '79, we had our first Korean American officer, head of the science officer, a very nice lady, and she did a great job. And you know, it's just the flow of things. So now I would guess a significant percentage of American officers at the American embassy here are Korean Americans. I mean, frankly, because many of them, you know, have at least some Korean language and are comfortable with the culture already. So it's kind of the lazy man's way to have expertise in the State Department, especially, but also in other agencies. Yeah. And by the way, you know, it's very troubling that the Trump administration can't get itself organized. It's not just Korea, as you probably know. Most countries in the world that had political appointees as ambassadors still don't have American ambassadors there. Unfortunately, well, by way of contrast, we do have American ambassadors already in Tokyo and Beijing. So I can see where the Koreans would be kind of upset that we still don't have an ambassador here. And it may take, you know, still several months before someone is in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just one afterward. I would, that book that I've written is far from perfect. There are errors in both the English and the Korean versions. If you see errors of fact, interpretation, translation, or any suggestions, you know, whenever if they ever sell out, we'll try to publish a corrected version. You can reach me at any time with this simple email address, straub@yahoo.com. Thank you.